Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the School Public Affairs First Friday event on the election. Welcome also to election week, as it's become, maybe election month, because some of the results are, and some of the most important results are not 100% clear yet. It looks like we've got about 100 folks in the audience so far, and thank you all for joining us. We have, I think, a terrific panel of experts to talk about where we are with the election results, both at the national level and at the Colorado level. And we're excited to start off. Towards the end of the event today, we'll have time for questions, which you can put in the Q&A, and we'll get to those as well. But I'm Paul Teske. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs. I'm excited to be here and to moderate this panel and to have our excellent panelists with us. A couple of quick logistics. Thank you to Emma Martz and Tula Wellbrook, our events and marketing folks at the School of Public Affairs, for putting this together. The School of Public Affairs has a bunch of other events. If you're so inclined to join us at noontime on November 11th, we have a discussion about social equity, a huge topic in our society right now, and a recent book from Professor Mary Guy of the School of Public Affairs on achieving social equity will be a topic of discussion, and Professor Guy will lead that. Again, that's noontime on November 11th. And then this First Friday series, which normally would be an in-person breakfast, but now is a lunchtime Zoom, bring your own lunch, is going to happen again in December, on this Friday, December 4th. The topic is pivoting government and sort of how to deal with innovative government in a time of COVID, lots of social equity and equity concerns and protests and other things going on. How do government agencies and government leaders deal with these kinds of problems? So lots more to come, but I'm sure the election is what's on most people's minds here. And we'll have the panel talk about all of these issues. And a panel today, we have Mike Littwin, who has a long and distinguished career in political journalism in Colorado and going back further in Virginia and DC and other places. He's covered a number of presidential races. He's currently a columnist for the Colorado Sun. And I would just note he posted a column, I think, just this morning about the election, about Trump, about Trumpism, about what the future looks like, and look forward to hearing a little bit about that from Mike. We also have Sean Walsh. Sean is a longtime election consultant, has worked in this space in Colorado for more than 20 years, and before that in Washington, D.C. and abroad. Sean has undergraduate degree from University of San Francisco and a master's from George Washington in D.C. And we're very excited and pleased to have Sean here for his perspectives. And third, we have Saja Hindi, who is a columnist, or excuse me, a reporter for the Denver Post. She is from North Carolina, got her undergraduate degree from North Carolina State University, and has written around political issues, immigration, and others in Colorado, in Fort Collins, in Loveland, and now for the Denver Post. And for this election, Saja has covered pretty heavily the ballot initiatives. So everybody's going to talk about everything, I think, today, but there'll be some areas that some folks have watched more than others. So just to start out, I mean, we have an hour more or less. You know, we could spend the whole hour on the U.S. presidential race, where it stands, you know, what it means, but we should spend some time on that. We won't spend the whole hour. If you follow this stuff obsessively, and maybe you do if you're on this webinar, along with the other 117 folks we now have, you know, they're counting ballots, right, in about 4 or 5 states: Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, maybe still North Carolina, and some others. Not all the numbers are in, but those are the states that will make the decision ultimately, and the ones that are closest. And if you followed it, you know, Pennsylvania, Biden's numbers pulled ahead this morning. Georgia, Biden's numbers pulled ahead slightly this morning. Nevada, Biden is ahead. And with what we know about the outstanding ballots there, he's likely to stay ahead. Arizona, Biden is ahead. And what we know about the outstanding ballots there is less clear. It's possible that Trump will make up some or all of the difference. And then there's still, in all of those states and others, some military ballots, some provisional ballots, some other kinds of ones still to be counted. But the consensus seems to be that Biden is in a good spot if he holds Pennsylvania and Nevada. He has enough electoral votes to win. He has won the popular vote at this point by about 4 million votes. He has the most votes, popular votes ever in an American election. I think, there's bad news and good news we're going to talk about today. One good news is that turnout was quite high around the country, setting records in many places. Turnout was quite high in Colorado, where we have as most of you know, a very effective mail-in ballot process that we've used for a long time. So I'll stop there with the background and get to our columnists. And I want to start with Mike. Again, you've written a column today about the presidential election, and just love to hear your thoughts on where this stands and what it means.
Well, when I went to sleep last night at about 3 a.m., it was still very up in the air. When I woke up this morning, that Biden had passed Trump in Pennsylvania and Georgia. The Pennsylvania one is the critical one. The blue wall that fell during 2016 was rebuilt by Joe Biden. That's why he was nominated, I believe, because he convinced people that he could rebuild that blue wall. He has, and it looks like he'll be the president. But of course, drama is just beginning. The drama of this election, it seems like it's gone on forever, and it will go on for a little while longer. The lawsuits are coming in, but there has been so far to this point, there has been lots of screaming, particularly from the president. There's been lots of whining, particularly from the president, but there has been no hard evidence of any kind shown that could shift 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 votes in Pennsylvania. It's a lot of votes to shift. Unless you can show a real theft of an election. You remember in 2016, they put a panel together to find the 3 million votes that Trump claimed were cast illegally. They didn't find any, as far as I know. And to think that they'll be able to overturn this in the courts, Trump is counting on his new 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court. This would not be Bush v. Gore, which was the court should never have intervened there. I'm remain positive on that. But this would be helping to organize a coup, and that's just not going to happen.
Thanks, Mike. Let's move next to Sean for some thoughts on the presidential race.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. There's so many different storylines to pursue. This is the first time I've done one of these panels where the events were still unfolding. Beside the outcome, I think there's a few process highlights. You mentioned the turnout. One of the big headlines from the 2020 election is related to the historic turnout. Not since 1908 have we seen such a number of people, percentage of the American public voting. In Colorado, our Secretary of State wasted no time in letting us know that the turnout in 2020 has exceeded the 2016 turnout by 0.01%, which is about 86%. One of my on-the-ground observations was the diversity of yard signs that didn't take a position on any candidate or issue. They just said vote. I don't recall in previous years seeing such a huge diversity of signs in Colorado urging people to vote without advocating for a particular candidate. The use of mail ballots, of course, was stimulated by the pandemic. Nationwide, a lot of us Coloradans from both parties were kind of mystified at all the trepidation, when several Midwestern and Eastern states announced they would be mailing ballots to voters, having fewer walk-in vote centers. Again, out of concerns about spreading COVID, we're fortunate to have mail voting ingrained in our culture here in Colorado. We've had lots of time over 20 years to work the bugs out. Even before the legislature mandated mail ballots in 2013, several county clerks in off-year elections would hold mail ballots since the late 90s. By way of contrast, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about Pennsylvania today, as Mike mentioned. It was only this year that Pennsylvania voters didn't have to give a reason for requesting that a ballot be mailed to them. Lastly, with respect to mail ballots, assuming there's no major instances of fraud or mismanagement, we're going to see a lot more states coming online with mail ballots without the urgency of a pandemic. And let's hope those same states are going to decide their deadlines prior to when people are voting. That's certainly another storyline here. Every state has its own unique rules on how ballots are received, how they're tabulated, how they're signed, how they're counted. as it should be. But let's hope there aren't any more judicial interventions in October, like we saw this year in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Just one more aspect of process I think you're going to hear again is that, once again, the pollsters, or rather the polling industry, got it wrong. Maybe not so much the internal polls that are proprietary, the ones that are conducted on behalf of the candidates or the parties. I'm talking more about the public polls, the ones commissioned by news media and other independent organizations. Many of these organizations released the results of national polls that had Biden up as much by 10 points, but in the final reckoning, it's looking closer to 3 or 4. The biggest distinction, of course, between 2016 and 2020 with respect to polling is that if trends continue, in those states you mentioned, Paul, at least they got the winner right this time. In 2016, the outcome was such a huge shock. There was this incredibly long and ugly hangover. How could this have happened? How could our pollsters have got it so wrong? So while you might hear some talk about pollsters getting it wrong again, it won't be nearly as pronounced in 2020 because they were right about the winner, less so about the margin of victory. But just like in 2016, the criticisms of polling, which are legitimate, will lead to some introspection on part of the industry, and as a result, better modeling and more creative ways of collecting the information.
Thanks, Sean. Saja, do you want to have some thoughts on the presidential race?
Sure, thanks for having me. So my coverage has obviously focused a lot more on Colorado, and in Colorado, the results were not unexpected with the presidential race, but obviously turnout was quite a bit higher than had initially anticipated, at least. And a lot of the voters that I talked to said their main driver was the presidential race, but I talked to a lot of first-time voters at the polls this year who said that there were some state issues that they felt like really tied into the presidential race in the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that really, really drove them to the polls. And I think another big discussion with the presidential race this year is the national popular vote. This is something that states have been discussing for the better part of the last decade and a half. Colorado is, and we can get more into it once we talk about this ballot issue, but Colorado voters affirmed that they did want the state to be part of this national popular vote compact. And so it brings back this issue of the presidential race and whether the president will be selected via electoral college votes or the national popular vote. So I think there's a lot of different layers to the race. And like you said, we're still waiting to hear what the results are. I don't think that that's really unexpected. I mean, in Colorado, we have most of the races figured out, but there are still a couple that are outstanding, and they're just really close races, and we're waiting to see what happens.
Thanks. So also at the national level, there was expectation about whether the U.S. Senate would change. Saja mentioned the Supreme Court, the Senate, of course, particularly important there, and confirming justices to the Supreme Court, and a lot of controversy recently about that. We had one of the most important Senate races that did turn in Colorado with former Governor Hickenlooper against the incumbent Cory Gardner, and Hickenlooper won by, it looks like, about 10 points. He's now been successful twice running for mayor, twice for governor, and now for Senate. It's not easy to win over an incumbent, but what do you make of the Hickenlooper Gardner race in Colorado? And maybe we'll start with Sean this time.
I thought it was kind of a snoozer, to be honest. I mean, I didn't think that it was very closely watched. I mean, the NRSC pulled out of the race, in mid-October. I think I wasn't impressed with John Hickenlooper's campaign, but then again, he didn't need to really hit it out of the park. I mean, with respect to how Colorado's been trending blue over the years, there was little about it that was so unsurprising to me. I think Cory Gardner ran a great race. I liked how he came across in the campaign. I'm obviously a supporter of his, and I was sad to see him go. But I don't think I don't know that there was ever a lot of hope. I mean, as soon as John Hickenlooper was kind of announced as a candidate, you know, give Hickenlooper credit. He's had a great run here, you know, a successful career in politics and in business. And I don't think he's a particularly inspired candidate for Senate. He made a statement during the presidential election about not having interest in running for Senate, which is probably true. But he got the call from Chuck Schumer, who made a great case for why he should be in the Senate. Again, I didn't see a lot of inspiration from what inspired the Hickenlooper candidacy. I don't think was so much internal as maybe external. Well, yeah, this is something I could probably win that. I don't know that there wasn't any great passion, but anyway, he didn't need it, and he won.
And of course, being in the Senate, you know, it's a lot better to be in the majority than the minority, and we'll see how that shakes out.
That will be tough for him. You know, he ran his own businesses. He was mayor. He was governor, and now he's going to be the most junior member of a party that's in the minority. That's going to be a difficult shift for him.
And I'll say maybe in the minority, right? We still have the Georgia and some would say Alaska race to look at. But Mike, what do you think of the Hickenlooper Senate race?
Well, I didn't think Corey ran a great race. I didn't think Corey had any avenue of winning. And the question is what he could have done better, and probably nothing. But the embrace of Trump at the beginning guaranteed that he would lose, and his attempts to be seen as a bipartisan senator were beaten down in every important vote. The ones that anyone paid any attention to, like impeachment, like voting to see to see witnesses during the impeachment trial, like the votes on Obamacare, the votes that anyone cared about, Corey was 100% with Donald Trump, and that would be a loser in Colorado, as we saw, with Trump being overwhelmingly beaten. And you know what's different this year in Colorado is that Colorado is not simply blue; it's bluer than nearly any state in the country. It is, it's West Coast blue, it's New England blue. This was a huge number for Trump to lose by in Colorado in a race that neither candidate tried in. So Hickenlooper did not run a great race. He didn't want to run the race. He got convinced that he should. I'm not convinced that he's the only Democrat who would have won. I think that he was basically just there. The race was about Trump, and it was about Gardner and Gardner's ties to Trump. And he couldn't overcome that. I know Dick Wadhams told me months and months and months ago that if Trump was going to lose by double figures, there was no way that Gardner could possibly win. And that, as he predicted, the National Republicans will pull out of the race. He still had plenty of money at the end, but I don't know where this leaves Gardner, and more important, I don't know where it leaves the Republican Party in Colorado. I mean, 2018 was a devastating race. Cory Gardner was held the only important statewide Republican seat in Colorado. Now that's gone. Republicans, they're in a catastrophic situation in Colorado.
We've been there before, Mike.
Not for a long time. Not for a long time. In 2004, when Colorado was deep red, many people were writing and I couldn't object even to the idea that Colorado was going to be red for the foreseeable future. That was the conventional wisdom, and it seemed right. Then Salazar won his Senate seat, and from there, it's just gone bluer and bluer and bluer. And I think, probably the main reason it's gone so blue is the influx of people who weren't in Colorado in 2004. And most of them are young, college educated, and inclined to vote Democratic. And I don't know how Republicans have to change their thinking and how to win races in Colorado if they want to start winning statewide races in Colorado.
If you anticipated a later question about is Colorado now blue, and what tone of blue, but I think the Democrats now, for the first time since 1936, by turning the CU regents, now control all statewide institutions for the first time since 1936. And I moved here in 2003, not as a young person, but from another state, and it's really trended in that blue direction since then. And I think we'll talk more later about how long, is that sort of on a pendulum that tends to swing in American politics, or are there longer term changes that are leading in that direction? I want to go to Saja for either some more comments on the Hickenlooper race or, Colorado as blue trending.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, with the U.S. Senate race, it was obviously a race that was heavily influenced by national politics. I mean, we talked about the polarization of Donald Trump. You have a changing electorate. There's issues with the coronavirus. And so, I mean, the polling did show that John Hickenlooper was expected to win, maybe not quite as big of a margin, but he did well with people in the suburbs, which that's also been trending nationally toward Democrats. And so, I mean, it wasn't unexpected, but it is something that is very representative, I think, of Colorado's changing electorate. In terms of whether the state is trending more blue, I mean, absolutely, based on what we've seen when it comes to state legislative races. I don't think Democrats, based on their spending, got exactly what they wanted. I mean, at the state house level, at least, they gained, it looks like, one seat in the Senate, which in the Senate will make a big deal because it's a lot less members, and they weren't able to pass some of the more progressive legislation that they wanted to last year. I think paid family leave is a good example of that, and that's why it ended up on the ballot. Coloradans ended up passing it. In the House, Democrats spent a lot of money on swing district seats. It ended up that they still are in, the numbers are still the same. Democrats have a 17-point lead there. But I think what I've heard from Democrats is that they were at least making progress in some of those swing districts. They forced some Republicans to fight for those seats, and they made some inroads, particularly in more red counties. At that same token, I mean, I talked to some GOP strategists after some of those races who've said, look, the GOP just has to make different decisions about training, about campaigning, about recruiting candidates in Colorado. And that doesn't necessarily mean, one of them at least said, that doesn't necessarily mean we need more centrist candidates, but we need people who aren't necessarily always towing the party line, but are looking out for their constituents. And that's different in swing districts than it may be in districts that are a lot more red. There's going to be some redistricting too, which will affect how the General Assembly's seats look like and what seats will be in play. And so I think that's something that is important to keep an eye out for. The Senate Majority Leader, when I talked to him about gaining that one seat, he said, it's obviously a big jump for us. It's not the 3 seats that they may have been looking at, but it sets them in a place for 2022 where Democrats may not have as much of an advantage as they do now.
Great. So you've teed up a lot of good points. I want to dig in deeper about the state legislature, and in between sort of the U.S. Senate and state legislature, I want to talk a little bit about Congress. The 7 seats, incumbents all held, with the exception of CD3, where Lauren Boebert had defeated incumbent Scott Tipton in the primary, and we knew that was going to be a close race against Dianne Mitz-Bush. Lauren Boebert won. Not a huge margin, but a decent enough margin. And so that's the one exception in the state where a Republican moved in that direction or stayed in that direction, but even a farther right Republican than Scott Tipton was. So Sean, what do you think we should make out of that race?
Well, I was Scott Tipton's campaign manager in 2010, so I do have some perspectives on the 3rd congressional. The urban-rural divide is more at play in Congressional District 3, similar to the 4th congressional as well. Certainly there are blue and red counties in the 3rd and the 4th, but there are several points of contention that have more to do with the rural-urban divide than what traditionally divides Republicans and Democrats, kind of in the metro area. Water, land use, energy, tourism, these are the lifeblood issues on the Western Slope in Southern Colorado. And as such, these are the issues where Republicans and Democrats agree. It's why third congressional voters can elect a Democrat potato farmer in 2004, John Salazar, and then a Republican businessman from Cortez in 2010, and then, you know, a 33-year-old gun-toting restaurant owner. It's a different shade of red and blue once you get outside of the 7-county metro area and the I-25 corridor. Diane Mitch Bush did not win enough votes in Mesa and didn't win Pueblo by enough the margin. Just like Republicans can win statewide if they don't run up the score in reliably red counties like Douglas, El Paso, Weld, and Mesa. It's going to be very difficult for a Democrat to win in the third congressional if they can't carry Pueblo by 20 points. Diane Mitch Bush only won Pueblo by a handful of votes, which is a virtual tie in Pueblo. Diane Mitch Bush raised double the amount of money in hard dollars and was the benefit of a lot more outside spending. I went to her website earlier before the election. I was surprised to see she posted endorsements from her former colleagues in the House who represent suburban Denver districts, Janet Buckner from Arapahoe County and Joe Salazar, a Bernie bro from Adams County. I was also surprised she posted the Denver Post endorsement. When I saw that endorsement from the Denver Post, if I was Lauren Boebert, I would have put that endorsement on every one of my mail pieces and reminded everyone on social media that my opponent is Denver's candidate. At the end of the day, I think Boebert's win was more the inspired candidate. She ran against a 10-year incumbent who also happened to be co-chair of the president's reelection campaign in Colorado. Her candidacy really wasn't about Donald Trump, but about gun issues. And Boebert won her primary by 10 points over Scott Tipton. It wasn't a surprising outcome for me in the third.
Okay. Mike, do you have thoughts on that race or other congressional ones?
It was a surprise for me, but I think it points in large part to the Republican problem in winning statewide. So if you have the faces of your party as Ken Buck and Lauren Boebert, who are hard right conservatives in a state which has always been centrist and is now, you have to say, center left, then you're going to have a hard time winning statewide. The state's not unanimously blue. No state is unanimously blue or unanimously red. Most states are within a 60-40 range. Most states are within a 55-45 range. So it's, where Colorado was turned is past a certain point where it's very difficult under today's circumstances to see a Republican winning in a statewide race. I mean, Cory Gardner is a very gifted politician. I don't deny Cory Gardner his gifts. He upset Mark Udall. It was a tough year for Democrats, but he still did upset him, and he ran a very smart race. He was seen as the model for Republicans in swing states at the time. There doesn't seem to be a model for Republicans in swing states now. I think, am I right that Susan Collins was the only senator who elected opposite the way her party picked in the presidential election? I think that's right. I think that Susan Collins was the only senator elected when the state voted for the president of the different party. And I think that shows where we are right now. I mean, pendulum swings, and the pendulum will definitely swing again. It always has. You don't have to read history very, very much to know that. But right now, we're sort of stuck in a place where you have Democrats who are divided in their own, but they are united against Trump, and then you have Trumpism. And I think we'll see when or if the pendulum swings next, when or if Republicans turn away, or if they do, turn away from Trumpism. And my guess is that right now, that Trump remains the most important voice in the Republican Party and will be for some time to come. It's not going to be Mitch McConnell. There will be a 2024 presidential election, and we'll see whom whom the Republicans nominate, and that will tell us a lot of the story about where the Republican Party is. Right now in Colorado, it's stuck blue, I think, for the near future. In the country, it's stuck towards the middle. And we're still, I wrote the column this morning. I mean, Biden may have won, but the country remains at this point just as divided as it was before Biden won.
Great points. I just at this point, I'll jump in with a public service announcement. It appears of the 130 audience, we have Julia Jackson is one, and she staffs the new redistricting commissions and plugs people to put in your resume to join those. They're due by next Tuesday, November 10th. And just for those of you who aren't aware of this, a couple of years ago, we passed these independent redistricting and reapportioning commissions that will make it a less political process than it's been in the past in Colorado, and somewhat less political than it's been around the country. Another kind of issue during the pandemic and during the election was the census, right? We're supposed to be counting and enumerating, and one expectation of that was that Colorado would gain an 8th congressional seat. I think that's still an expectation, and the census kind of got cut off both for the reasons of the pandemic and the president kind of wanting to stop it sooner. But I think it's basically finished. And in any case, the 8th, if we do get an 8th congressional seat, we'll be reconfiguring some of this. Any thoughts on how that will play out? I mean, the population growth has mostly been in Metro Denver and the Front Range. But Saja, do you have any thoughts on the whole census, redistricting, reapportioning?
To be honest, I can't speak to it or in a lot of detail, but I do know that Colorado's numbers for the U.S. Census were pretty high, and so they are expecting at least one additional district. I think that Republicans and Democrats right now are waiting to kind of see what happens before they start figuring out, where the new lines are. Some of the people that I talked to over the past week have just said, it's hard for us to be able to recruit candidates starting now for 2022, just because we don't know what that's going to look like. And so it's definitely something that they're keeping an eye on.
I think Sean probably could speak more to this than anybody else, but in all likelihood, the next seat will come carved mostly out of Metro Denver, and you can expect that a Democrat will probably fill it. But the idea of the commission is tremendous. I'm totally in favor of it. We've seen a lot of redistricting done by courts, and that's not really a great idea because they couldn't agree in the legislature. So the commission's a great idea, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that, Sean. But yeah, I'm assuming Democrats will pick up a seat.
No, as a partisan Republican, I'm happy to see, because we were on the bad end of the stick, if you will, the short end of the stick in 2000. The last time when we got the 7th congressional, and I like where we're going with either Y or Z, I forget, but to kind of diffuse and take a little bit of the partisanship out of the process. I was looking at some of the criteria. I was thinking maybe I should apply, but I'm a registered lobbyist. No registered lobbyists are allowed, which I think is a good rule. But I'm especially interested to see how it plays out. It doesn't mean that these commissioners can't be lobbied. There will still be efforts to persuade that. I'm a little bit skeptical about this inclusion of unaffiliated voters. In Colorado, we have an enormous and growing population of unaffiliated voters. And unaffiliates aren't necessarily moderates. Unaffiliates just choose not to be part of a political party. There's a lot of unaffiliated voters for whom the Republican Party isn't conservative enough. There's a lot of unaffiliated voters for whom the Democrats aren't progressive enough. So I worry about these unaffiliated. I know that there's a kind of a vetting process. I'm excited to see some of the outcome, and it'll be very interesting. I mean, I predict that we will get a seat at the expense of I think nationally. I think we're going to see red states getting more population at the expense of blue states, I think, which is going to then stimulate more conversation about the Electoral College, right? If the electoral map increasingly benefits Republicans with in-migration from blue states to red states, it's going to stimulate a lot more conversation about the Electoral College and the national popular vote.
Yeah, it's also, in states that don't have commissions and in states where this thing is still will be hyper political. I mean, Texas will gain 2 seats probably. And of course, the Texas redistricting right now is so heavily in favor of Republicans when the vote this time was Democrats got something like 47%. So if the redistricting were done fairly, Democrats would actually pick up those. My daughter is a professor at the University of Texas, and in Austin is divided into, I think, 5 districts, and that's how it works in Texas, and it works that way in a lot of other states. So I'd love to see these commissions go forward in every state, and not all the states have as we do have an initiative process that is so open. If states had initiative processes across the country, there would be commissions across the country.
Yeah. And just a quick point in Weld County, the county commissioner districts are all drawn. There's 5 commissioner districts in Weld County. Every one of them have some small portion of Greeley, which, I mean, just imagine a state like Colorado where everybody's got to have some slice of Denver. Imagine what that would look like. So I think the possibilities are endless about what this commission could come up with respect to just both the legislative redistricting that's going to happen too, and the federal.
Yeah, they are restricted, of course, by population. So that is, where the population is, we know where the population is. So there's only so much that can be done. It's done on the margins, but there's only so much that can be done and still have the population numbers in correct order.
Yeah, and in the results for the 7 Colorado Congress races, congressional races, they weren't close, right? Except for the CD3, Lauren Boebert that we talked about, and even CD6 with Jason Crow, having a tough time 2 years ago with Mike Kaufman in unseating him for, as a long-term incumbent. He, was 58 or so, 58-42 or something finally, I think, against Steve House in CD6. So just, right now the congressional seats are not very competitive with one exception. And so it'll be interesting to see if the commission, changes any of that. Saja had gotten a little bit into the state house, the legislature. It looks like the House Assembly stayed at 41-24, and the Senate, the Democrats picked up 1 seat. You mentioned, Saja, earlier that might lead to a somewhat more progressive agenda. We also, of course, have, he wasn't up for election, but Governor Polis. So the Dems pretty solidly control the three branches. What do you see coming out of that? And, is that at risk in the near future, or is that a pretty solid state of play?
I mean, I think it's definitely, like you mentioned, the Democrats have control in the state. And last year, at least in the Senate, they couldn't completely coalesce around a death penalty repeal. And they had issues with family leave and an eviction moratorium. I think with this added seat in the Senate, or added cushion, they'll be able to pass a lot more legislation that maybe they weren't able to with more moderate Democrats. In terms of, somebody I think had mentioned this in the comments, and I've been thinking about it too, but they said that they don't necessarily see Colorado as more blue, but they see it as more anti-red, or I guess in this election, maybe more anti-Trump. And, I think that's definitely going to help Democrats in the years to come. I think that 2022 could be very different. And we talked a lot about the redistricting and what that may look like. But they have a pretty big cushion right now. And so that could potentially translate to policy in the legislature. One of the lawmakers I talked to this week who is part of leadership had said, I don't know that Colorado is necessarily as blue as Democrats think, but I also don't think that it's as red as Republicans want. And so I think we're going to see a lot of different kinds of candidates in the coming couple of years that maybe will appeal to more of those unaffiliated voters who came out in record numbers again this year. But there could be a lot of legislation this year related to coronavirus and the economic recession, and Republicans are a little bit concerned about what Democrats will do.
Saja, could you speak to the Democrats in the legislature and their relationship with Jared Polis? I know many progressives would say that the big restraint in passing some of the legislation was not moderate Democrats, but Jared Polis. What would you say about that relationship, and how do you see it changing or not changing?
I think there, like you mentioned, there's definitely some tensions there. There are a couple of different bills towards the end of the session last year either didn't pass or completely changed because there were a lot of negotiations with the governor's office, and a lot of people see that the governor has a more libertarian lean, and so they have to change the legislation. And I think that definitely will continue to play, particularly as the coronavirus response is, as those are addressed. I think that potentially the governor will see that there are a lot more Democrats who were elected, and Coloradans have supported some of these more progressive ideas. I don't know if that will translate into different kinds of legislation that he would support, but I think it's definitely something that they're going to have to discuss and look at very closely these coming couple of years.
Great.
What's your thought on this?
Moving through.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
We haven't talked too much about the Senate, the U.S. Senate, which really is the elephant in the room in more than one respect. I don't see anyone out there speculating that Democrats, poor Georgia. Here we are feeling sorry for ourselves. We're having to endure this incredible, highly politically charged negative campaign for the last year. Georgia has 2 more months. Georgia's not going to decide until January 5th on the 2 Senate replacements, but it's looking like there's going to be, both sides are going to put enormous resources into Georgia, and that has huge implications. The Senate staying in Republican hands. People need to remember that, Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell go back to 1985, which is probably longer than a lot of people on this Zoom call who were not born back then. But that's a relationship that goes back a long way. And if I'm Joe Biden, I'm privately praying that the legislature stays in Republican. Imagine if the Senate goes D. I know, Paul, I see your face. You're skeptical. You're very skeptical about what I just said. But to hear me out, if the Democrat goes D, if the Senate goes Democrat, it's going to change. It's going to change everything in Washington about the legislation that gets passed, the appointments, who Biden chooses. It's going to change even down to Colorado, even down to what our legislature is going to do. I think there's a lot of progressives that are going to really chafe at Joe Biden's, deal cutting. There was a story in Politico today about a lot of what Barack Obama was able to get out of Mitch McConnell's Senate was some of that conversation between Joe Biden lobbying his former colleague in the Senate. So the Senate going Democrat or staying Republican has implications all the way down to the Colorado legislature.
I would guarantee that Joe Biden is rooting for the Democrats in Georgia. I remember when Hickenlooper was first elected, and the thought was that he was better off with a split legislature, and I think there was some truth to that, and that there wasn't this onrush of liberal legislation, which Hickenlooper was not necessarily comfortable with. But I think in looking at the Democrats right now, there is a lot of really, really, to Democrats, important legislation that has to be addressed. We're not talking about, AOC's Green New Deal. We're talking about climate change, we're talking about the environment, and we're talking about Obamacare, and we're talking about a lot of things that are central to the Democratic project that may not happen unless there's a Democratic Senate. So I guarantee that Biden is rooting for a Democratic Senate.
I disagree. I couldn't disagree more. Listen, if Joe Biden wasn't such a creature of Washington, you have to go back to the last century to find someone who is more ingrained in that DC culture of deal cutting. I mean, not even Lyndon Johnson hadn't been in the Senate or House longer than Joe Biden. I mean, give Joe Biden credit for having won this, but I don't see him as much of a visionary. I see him as a deal cutter. I see him as somebody who I can't see Joe Biden, advocate. And sorry, Mike, I think that for a lot of progressive Democrats, the Green New Deal is the standard.
That would never pass the Senate with the 50-50 Senate. That would never pass. I promise you, it wouldn't be close. Well,
but it would still be more. It would definitely be more of the conversation there. It would still and Joe Biden.
It's going to be a conversation regardless.
Yeah, but Joe Biden needs Mitch McConnell to remain as the Beelzebub, the dark prince, stopping all of the progressive agenda, so he can get through. He can keep the progressives at bay and proceed with some kind of a more moderate agenda that observes that half this country voted for Joe Biden's opponent. We're back to Donald Trump here. I mean, yes, and I disagree with you too, Mike. I think Donald Trump is going to go away a lot faster than you think. I think Republicans are going to be quick to throw him under the bus faster than you think. However, the grassroots, the people that elected Donald Trump aren't, and they're going to be making big decisions.
And that's why Republicans are.
Does Colorado stay blue in 2022? It depends a lot about what happens.
So you think Rubio and Cotton and Cruz and those guys are going to throw Trump under the bus?
Yes.
It'd be interesting when they run for president in 2024.
It was a forced marriage. That the relationship was entirely
transactional. I understand that. Of course it is. But it's going to remain transactional. I mean, the person who runs in the Republican primary in 2024, if that person is perceived as anti-Trump, when a great majority of Republicans are not anti-Trump, that's going to be a very difficult road to hoe. And that's why I think that Trumpism is here to stay for at least the near future.
Okay.
We'll see.
I think, so
one of us will be wrong.
Yeah. And we've got some good disagreement.
Speaking as a progressive, I can tell you that progressives know that their legislation would have no chance in a 50-50 Senate. They're well aware of that.
So we'll see. We'll see how the Senate shakes out and what that means. I like to see some disagreement and that's good.
We've disagreed for a long time.
That's good. So as we move along with time, I want to make sure we get to the Colorado ballot issues and then to some of the questions that are on the board. And we can start with Saja on the ballot initiatives. So I'll just, as most of you know, there were 11 state ballot initiatives. They ranged all over the map, from repealing Gallagher to bringing back the wolves and making bingo a little easier, I guess. To my surprise, most of them passed because if you look historically, about 40% of these things, 45 pass, and most of them don't. They range from liberal things that pass, progressive things, to some tax cuts and conservative tax policy. So what do we make out of all of them, and which ones were the most important in your mind, Saja?
Yeah, I mean, I think Colorado voters were definitely in a yes mood this election. They approved a lot of these measures. One of the things that I kept hearing prior to the election is Colorado voters always vote fiscally conservative for statewide issues, but not necessarily for elected office. And obviously this election proved us wrong. I mean, they approved some of these conservative fiscal measures like the tax cut, asking for approval of fees, but then they also approved things like one of the most progressive paid family and medical leave programs in the country. So I think that there's a lot to dig deeper on that and kind of see what happened. But some of the analysts that I've talked to have said, well, Colorado voters just really look at the individual issues and kind of try to determine what that will mean for their lives. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so a tax cut seems like something that voters might want to approve. Family leave, a lot of the campaign for it also focused on coronavirus and on people who've had to take time off work to take care of family members. And so I think that really played a big role. And then we have abortion. It was a 22-week ban proposed. And a lot of the polling ahead of time showed that as a very tight race. More people seem to be in favor of abortions later in pregnancy, bans later in pregnancy or restrictions later in pregnancy. But Colorado voters in the past have rejected personhood amendments, and they voted against this one too. And a lot of the campaign finance reports for this one showed that national organizations and people from all across the country were spending money on this campaign because after the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the national discussion about abortion, people were heavily taking part in this. And I actually talked to one of the proponents or the opponents of the measure this morning, and she said anytime that one of these measures comes up on the ballot, we actually feel like our campaign and our awareness in Colorado becomes stronger. Colorado is one of 7 states that doesn't really have gestational restrictions. And so people from around Colorado also come to the state for abortions. And with a potential change in Roe v. Wade and some of these other states that have trigger laws, Colorado's place in that could become even more important. So you have that. And then you have, like you said, the repeal of Gallagher, which is something that people have been trying to do, Republicans and Democrats, for years, and they haven't been able to accomplish. But this year they, again, used the pandemic, they showed, and the wildfires across the state, and they showed what it would do if it wasn't repealed. And so I think that probably helped as well. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different measures this year that do very different things, but Colorado voters came out and voted yes for most of them. And I think you and I were actually talking about, or the group was talking about Amendment 76, which is a measure to essentially say only citizens can vote in Colorado elections. And that's already obviously a federal law. It's already a state law, but what it could do is prevent 17-year-olds in Colorado from voting in the primaries. 17-year-olds are only allowed to do that if they're going to be 18 by the time of the general election. And a lot of the people against that measure have said that it's a very anti-immigrant measure. Some other states, Colorado hasn't indicated that they would do this that I'm aware of, allow residents, regardless of whether they're citizens or not, to vote in some of the local elections. And so you had that, which also had a lot of influence from other states. So I think there was just a lot going on. And as many measures as there were actually a lot more planned, but proponents just couldn't get enough signatures during the pandemic because it was a lot harder to be going door to door and holding these big events where people would sign on.
Great. Yeah, no, lots going on with the ballots. Mike, do you have thoughts on any of them or the general picture that?
I think that each outcome was predictable, and each outcome I think is basically Colorado. And Gallagher, the Gallagher change was, I think, in large part because rural Republicans were in favor of it, and that changed, I think, a lot of the thinking on repealing Gallagher. The anti-abortion one, I think, is really important. I'm of the opinion that the Supreme Court, being very political, and I don't mean that in a wrong way, I think will probably not overturn Roe v. Wade. I think it would be a disaster for the Republican Party if Roe v. Wade were overturned. I think they'll probably try to steer cases away from overturning Roe v. Wade. But I think what Colorado said, this is basically the most moderate anti-abortion initiative that the movement could put out there, and it was roundly rejected. And I think that sort of settles, at least for the near future, where we are on abortion in Colorado. I assume that the Supreme Court had some influence on that, but I think if Ruth Bader Ginsburg were alive, the result wouldn't have been that much different. And so I think I think those two were the important ones. As far as the income tax, that was, if Colorado were 2/3 blue, it would still win by 60%. So, people always point to the fact that things like that go down, and that point to the fact that Colorado is not as blue as they think it is. Colorado is not liberal. It's blue and liberal are two different things. They're Democratic. They're not liberal. They still nominate centrist candidates like Kickalooper, like Bennett, like Salazar, like Udall. Polis was supposed to be a radical. He's now, seen as a moderate liberal. So, I mean, that's where that's where we are in Colorado right now. Center left.
Well, if Colorado is blue, which I totally agree with you, Mike. I often will disagree with a lot of my Democrat friends, a lot of Democrat consultants who try to assure me, no, we're still a purple state, or we're light blue. No, we're very blue. And I think back to, with respect to, how voters voted on these statewide issues. I mean, again, back to that rural urban divide, I think I haven't done the full blown analysis. I mean, you're going to see that happen by people a lot smarter than me, just looking at turnout by county. And you'll see just, the farther you get away from Denver, just how much different perspectives are. Just take Gray Wolf. I voted with the ranchers. I said, well, I looked at it like, well, let's see, what the Farm Bureau says about it. Who's really impacted by whether or not there are gray wolves in a meaningful way, like eats a $10,000 calf of yours, like really seriously impacts someone. I talked to my neighbor the other day who said he was voting for it because about just kind of he was very abstract about it. Usually when you introduce a predator to an environment, health, and it's better for the environment. Gray wolves was an abstraction for people in Denver. I mean, we don't have them, in City Park, but they have a real world impact outside of Denver. I mean, I think that's the one thing that I'm more concerned about than this kind of Republican Democrat divide in our state than the rural urban divide. I think that's going to have a lot more implications. Denver, I think it was it might be the only county here in Denver where that income tax decrease failed by 58% in Denver. That the citizenship one failed by the same number, 58% in Denver. Everywhere else it passed. So increasingly, you're going to see Denver the Metro County, and in particular Denver County, really out of step with the rest of the state on a lot of issues that are immensely impactful for our economy.
I think that is true. I mean, but the fact is that most of the votes are in Metro Denver. A great percentage of the people are in Metro Denver. So if rural Colorado wants to influence Metro Denver, they need to figure out the best way to do that because they don't have the votes. So they have to be able to use persuasion. And this, I would say electing Lauren Boebert isn't necessarily a clue that there will be this kind of persuasion that is amenable to the blue urban centers. The reason people think Texas is going to eventually go blue is not so much because of the Latino vote, which of course is important, but which many Latinos in Texas vote Republican. It's because of the urban-rural divide in Texas, and now Texas is becoming overwhelmingly urban, and that's true in most of the blue states. So Colorado, I think, if I were talking to Republicans, I would say it's up to them to figure out a way to persuade them with that point. Now, the problem with the initiative system is that most people have no idea whether introducing wills is a good idea or a bad idea. The great majority of voters have no idea whatsoever. They have no idea about the Gallagher Amendment. As far as that goes, most people don't understand the Gallagher Amendment. They don't know what they were voting for. They don't know what the Gallagher Amendment does. This is not the flaw of the voters in Colorado. It's the flaw in the initiative system. But that said, I think the initiative system is good on the whole, but I do think it has these flaws. And if you look at paid leave, yeah, most people for paid leave. I'm definitely for paid leave, but how are you going to put that in play? How are you going to pay for it? What doesn't get paid for? These are all issues that will now be faced by the legislature. They're not easy issues.
Yeah, and I think,
Sean, I'm going to jump in if it's okay. Just move us on a little bit. We're at 1 o'clock, which isn't a hard stop, and we do have some questions, although we did actually answer a number of them as I scanned through them. But there's a couple of questions about national voter suppression, mail-in ballots, and whether this election, we talked a little bit about this, that hopefully it'll stimulate, more states to do what Colorado does. And any other thoughts on that? I mean, do you feel like voter suppression ended up being a big deal? I mean, we don't know ultimately how these Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia recounts are going to go, but do you feel like the election on balance went fairly well around the country, given our expectations?
well, we'll see, but I think so far so good. I mean, the president's outlandish comments aside, I mean, again, Mike made a good point. I mean, that like a lot of the allegations he's making are just not supported by any of the evidence. But I think we're going to see more of this, voting by mail nationwide. And I think, as things progress, I think we're going to see a lot more, the explanations about what actually happened and why it happened and when it did. The eastern states counting going up at 7 o'clock at that first tranche with the election day votes instead of the votes that were sitting in the bins for the last few weeks, and not having processed those, I think is going to be. I think it went well, and I think over time, as it trends Biden's way here, because there's obviously going to be some problems among the grassroots, but by and large, I think it was conducted. I did not like, and I think it's actually kind of outrageous in Pennsylvania. I mentioned it kind of briefly, but the fact that the judiciary is intervening in October in a, kind of moving the goalpost, did it have much to do with who could vote or who couldn't? I don't think it's a voter suppression issue, but the fact that wasn't decided in July is a big deal, and I hope a lot of these states that now are going to be doing mail ballot. I hope they take advantage of talking to some of the experts, many of which are here in Colorado, about how to really conduct and think comprehensively about how a mail election should be conducted. That they're not tinkering with the process, in October.
I think another thing you could say about the successful mail-in elections in Colorado is we now have same-day registration. And if anyone can show, nobody has, that same-day registration exposes fraud, then maybe we should look at it again. But if it doesn't lead to fraud, then it leads to easier voting. And just personal point of view, more people who vote, the better it is, and more access to voting, the better it is. So, if I'm hoping that liberalizing the voting becomes part of that mail-in voting scheme.
Great. Saja, do you have thoughts on?
I reported quite a bit on Colorado's system this year, just because there was so much discussion about how it would work nationally. And obviously Colorado's system has had years to perfect it, and so many other states have used it as an example. In Colorado, I would say that there were a few different reports about potential voter suppression or people kind of getting in the way at the ballot boxes. really only the Attorney General ruled one issue that was actually not at a ballot box as voter intimidation. And then last I checked, there was another incident in Littleton that was being investigated. But for the most part, a lot of the concerns in Colorado turn out to either be misinformation or disinformation, according to elected officials. And really a lot of it was just focused on what was going on nationally and how it impacted Colorado. But for the most part, we haven't heard of a ton of problems yet.
Great. So I think for me, just two more questions. One from the audience. There's a question about we didn't get into the Denver 11 ballot initiatives, from pit bulls to, homeless and climate taxes. But there is a question about the climate tax that apparently is going to generate $30 or $40 million a year for climate change issues at the local level in Denver. Jerry Tianino is asking, is that a big deal? Is that something, other municipalities might look at? Is that a bottom-up response to climate change when we don't have one from the top down? Any thoughts on that?
It's symbolic. It's symbolic. And again, if Democrats pull out 2 elections in Georgia, and I'm skeptical they can do that, but if they do, then I think you'll see a lot of change in spending on climate change.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. It's completely. If anybody is laboring under any kind of a hope that this is going to move the needle, because we have this little itty bitty tax that's going to do, I don't know, maybe reduce carbon emissions by 0. Whatever percent. It is symbolic. I think, I think that the 2 taxes that were passed Tuesday, plus the 4 taxes that were passed last year in 19, now we have separate funding streams for the homeless, for green energy, for parks, for healthy food, for, on down the line. But my concern with that is, it's kind of death by 1,000 cuts. I worry that working people in this city are going to have a hard time making ends meet if we keep raising taxes on them. I mean, people, there's a lot of people in the city that are trying to get by on, $50,000 a year, and we keep raising taxes on those people for issues that really aren't going to affect them in a great. And the other problem is, there's nothing stopping proponents from going back and asking for just a little bit more. Think of how much more we could do with just a little bit more money. Denver voters are enormously generous. I was shocked that certain economic development groups weren't more vocally opposed to those taxes. We are competing in a non-pandemic world. We're competing for tourists here and for business, and it's going to make it a lot harder for Denver to attract businesses to relocate here if we keep raising taxes.
I think you are right to an extent, Sean, but I also think that it reflects a difference in how Denver voters see the world and how the state legislature sees the world. If the state legislature with more Democrats bends a little more towards the Denver view of the world, I'm not expecting that necessarily, but if they do, I think you would see fewer of those kinds of things on a Denver ballot.
So I want to conclude with maybe one last unfair question to each of you. 10 years from now, what will we highlight from this election, or will it just fade into the other elections in terms of impact? And or is it, as going into the election, there was a sense that this is the election of our times, right? And it has to go the right way from both sides. And so I maybe go from Saja to Sean to give Mike the last word on that. What do you think this election will be remembered for, both in Colorado and nationally?
I mean, I think 2020 has taught us not to have too many expectations or too many predictions. But I mean, I think this was a really, really big year, a really interesting year. I mean, you had all of the things we talked about. We have the coronavirus pandemic. We had a very polarized presidency. We had a reckoning for racial justice and protests across the country. And so, I mean, I don't know that things are going to drastically change next year, But I do think that a lot of issues that Americans have been dealing with for the past 10 years or however long are going to be like, this is the year that people started bringing a lot of this back to the forefront. And I think what happens in this election will be remembered.
I think it'll be interesting. I think the Trump effect is going. I think he really did say what you want about the president. Say what, I mean, a lot of people disagree with his policies, but that guy accomplished, or nearly accomplished, everything he set out that he was going to do. Whether it was, moving the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that every president before him had promised and never done, on immigration, on taxes, on regulation, he delivered. And I think he did set the bar in terms of what, at least meeting expectations with his base. One of the things that I'm concerned about, if we don't have that governor that the Electoral College represents, we're going to have, the Ivanka Trump party and the Chelsea Clinton party, and we're going to, as the parties become less effective, if we're not going to be electing our leaders by, at least a 50% of some, 50% majority of some electorate out there, the states, I think we're in for much different times. 10 years ago, 10 years from now, I think what Trump did was, I think I think it's going to be harder for establishment politicians to run for president. You're going to see more people coming from business, from sports. Don't be surprised to see some people you never even thought of running for president or senate in the future. I think that's one of the ways that this president certainly has affected future outcomes.
Well, I think it's an easy question, actually. I think that that the Trump era will be written about for 100 years, and the explanations for how it came to be and how it came to an end, if it is an end, will be the point of a thousand history books, not to mention lots of popular history, but real history books. And the question for me is whether the nation particularly turned. I mean, Trump won 48, it'll probably be 47 or maybe a high 46s before it's over. But he won 47% of the vote during a time of pandemic, which most people disapprove of how he handled it, during a time of economic crisis, and during a time where much of the country erupted over racial injustice, and yet he still barely lost. So this is not a firm rejection of Trumpism, is the point that I've made, and that I continue to believe. But it was the rejection of Trumpism, and Trump himself won't be back. Where the Republican Party goes from here, I don't know. And I think that will be the interesting thing going forward in our nation's politics. But what this election will be remembered for Trump and Trump only. Joe Biden will take a very small space in the history books. He'll be at the bottom of the lead paragraph. It'll be all about Trump, and as it should be.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your fabulous comments. Thanks to our audience for hanging in with us for this a little more than an hour. And specifically, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Saja, for your excellent comments. And
Thank you.
We'll see how this all plays out.
Thanks for including us.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a good weekend.